The Miami Dolphins are 1-2 on the year after a 24-3 loss to the Seattle Seahawks. This is a far cry from where they were through 3 games during the 2023 regular season, as they had 2 games in their first 3 last year in which they had 36 or more points, including the big 70-point game against Denver. Miami combined for 106 points in their Week 1 and Week 3 games last year, and believe it or not, they scored more in both of those games than they have cumulatively through the first 3 weeks of the 2024 season. The Miami Dolphins have 33 total points through the first 3 games of the 2024 season, and the outlook for this franchise is very bleak. Now, I know you may be thinking, well, this isn't fair because Tua got hurt and they would have put up more points against Seattle in Week 3, and that's probably true, and I acknowledge that, but I don't think Miami was going into Seattle and beating that defense with Tua, and obviously we wish the best for Tua in his recovery, but he looked terrible in the Week 2 game against the Bills before leaving with injury. And in today's video, we're going to dive into why the Miami Dolphins' future is frightening. And there's a lot to dive into, and it's not just an overreaction to a 21-point road loss with a backup quarterback. We're going to dive into the struggles this franchise has faced over the past 9 or 10 months and what the future may hold for this team. Now let's begin. And we are starting today's video by breaking down a couple of concerns I have with this team moving forward, and it goes back to last year. Over the Dolphins' last 13 games, they have put up 265 total points, which includes the playoff game against the Chiefs, in which they only put up 7. 265 points over those 13 games equates to around 20.4 per game, which would have ranked tied for 21st with the Los Angeles Chargers based on the 2023 season. But when you dive into the numbers and you put context around the numbers, there's a few things that need to be acknowledged. During this 13-game span, which dates back to Week 9 of last year, the Dolphins put up 30 or more points in 3 of those games. 2 of those games came against the Jets, in which they were quarterbacked by Tim Boyle, Trevor Siemian, and even Zach Wilson. The other 30-plus point game came against the Washington Commanders, who would go on to finish the 2023 season with a 4-13 record and have the number 2 pick in the draft. Those games were outliers relative to how the Dolphins have played over the last baker's dozen games, and this goes back to the narrative of the Dolphins not being able to beat good teams, and the results show this. And if you take those 3 games, which again are clear outliers, then the Dolphins' 265 points over the last 13 games dwindles down to 156 points in 10 games, and that 20.4 points per game shrinks all the way down to just 15.6 per game. And I know Tua being out at the moment certainly doesn't help things, but the slide for this team was starting while Tua was playing. Tua very much started the final 3 games of the Dolphins' 2023 season, in which they put up just 40 total points against the Ravens, Bills, and Chiefs, as they would be outscored 103-40 in Week 17, 18, and the wild card round. And to be completely honest, the Dolphins are a 2-play sequence away from being 0-3 to start the 2024 season. That 2-play sequence was a fumble on the goal line followed by a Tyreek Hill 80-yard touchdown on the very next play. That sequence saved Miami from going down 21-10 rather than being up 17-14 late in the third quarter. And even within that game, the lone game they've won so far in 2024, they didn't look good in that game outside of a few plays, the Tyreek 80-yard touchdown of course being one of them. Miami averaged just 3.2 yards per carry in that game, and the leading rusher for them was Jeff Wilson, who had just 26 rushing yards on 5 carries. Within the Jags game, Devon Achane had 10 carries for 24 yards, and Raheem Mostert had 6 carries for 9 yards. The Buffalo game was a complete disaster, and they were down 31-10 before Tua got hurt, and even with a healthy Tua, this was a great example of how the Dolphins are always going to be limited. Miami lost the turnover battle 3-0, and I think the worst thing for them in this game, aside from Tua getting hurt of course, was Buffalo didn't look that great offensively. Yes, James Cook had a great game and made some plays, but Buffalo's offense was on the field for less than 24 minutes in the game, and they had just 247 yards of total offense. Josh Allen is a player who I believe is an MVP candidate every year, but he had just 139 yards passing, and despite him being a really good dual-threat quarterback, he only had 2 rushing yards on the night. Miami was dominated before the injury, and they had just 30 total points in 2 games. And what I think is also very concerning about the Dolphins is they haven't been able to run the ball either. Now, I know losing Connor Williams and Robert Hunt in free agency was always going to be tough, as each were very good players last year, and especially Connor Williams when he was healthy in the run game, but Miami is averaging just 3.7 yards per carry through 3 games, and that is obviously in the bottom 10 of the NFL. What's frustrating is it's not like they haven't been trying to run the football either, as they rank in the upper half of the league in rushing attempts through the first 3 weeks. For reference, they averaged 5.1 yards per carry in 2023, which led the NFL. There's a reason we often discuss complementary football on the channel, and it's because football is the ultimate team game. You can't be a one-dimensional offense and expect to win a ring. There may be a crazy outlier year here or there, but the Dolphins are not going to be that team with Tua as their quarterback in 2024, or even 2025 for that matter. They have to be able to run the football to be able to set up the passing game, and to get the ball into Tyreek and Jalen Waddle's hands routinely, and the results have spoke for themselves. What also concerns me for the Dolphins moving forward is how this roster has been constructed over the past few years. Yes, hitting on Jalen Phillips was nice, and the same thing applies to Javon Holland, Kader Kohou, Jalen Waddle, and you get the point, but the Dolphins choosing to go all in this year with free agent acquisitions was baffling. Bringing in old veterans like Calais Campbell, Jordan Poyer, Odell Beckham was never a move I was a big fan of for a few reasons. They internally thought they were going to be competing for a Super Bowl. You don't bring in those guys unless you think they are the 1 or 2 missing pieces between losing in the wild card round and going to win the big game. Not only that, but this team lost several players in free agency, including 2 $100 million guys in Christian Wilkins and the aforementioned Robert Hunt. This team got worse in the trenches from 23 to 24, and somehow, some way, they convinced themselves that they were going to be able to figure it out and that this could be their year, and it's not. I don't like to do the big overreaction after a single game and say that a team is done or that they might as well pack it in, but 3 weeks is telling for where this team is, and the problems from last year are still here. And for a team that's 1-2 and not going to be the number 1 seed in the AFC, meaning if they would even make the playoffs this year, and that's a big if in itself, but do you honestly think that even with a healthy Tua, this team is going to any of the premier AFC contending teams and winning not just 1 playoff game, but 3 in a row? And to me, the answer is a resounding no. They have played the division rival Buffalo Bills 3 times since week 4 of the 2023 season, and in those 3 games, Miami has been outscored 100-44. And please remember, they were already down 31-10 when Tua was still in the week 2 game this year. They lost in Buffalo last year 48-20 with a healthy Tua, who played the entire game. And please remember, this team was 9-3 and had a 3-game division lead as Buffalo fell to 6-6 before Miami lost 3 of their final 5 games, including the week 18 game against Buffalo in which they were beat at home with a score of 21-14. They can't beat good teams, they've struggled big time out of the gate in 2024, and they have an aging roster that simply is not talented enough to win 12 or 13 games in a season. To make matters worse, Miami's offensive line has regressed, and it looked particularly bad against Seattle. So when you think about the Dolphins situation, and you think about the great players they have, whether it's Tyreek, Jalen Waddle, even Devon Achane, who has certainly flashed at times, it doesn't matter if you can't get the ball to them. Seattle's run defense was notoriously bad over the past 2 years, and that was a big reason why they lost so many games over the last few years, but they dominated this game. Miami had 65 yards rushing in week 3, and Achane had 11 carries for just 30 yards with a long run of 13. Excluding a single carry, Achane had 10 carries for 17 yards, and there's a problem with Miami because they're not a position or 2 away. They're several. I don't know how serious you can take Tyreek Hill for saying he was going to retire after a contract a couple of years ago, mainly because things change so fast in the NFL, but what I will say is Tyreek is 30 years old and he's not going to play forever. It's obviously not going to be easy to eventually replace a player who has back-to-back 1,700-yard seasons and is the only player in NFL history to do so. Sure, the Dolphins are going to have good players on their roster, and they're going to beat up on bad teams, when healthy of course, because losing your starting quarterback for a couple of games obviously isn't ideal. I know they are still waiting for Bradley Chubb to come back as he tore his ACL in the Baltimore game last year, which was on New Year's Eve, and sure, having Bradley would be nice, but he doesn't help the problems the offense is having. I know I have said before how much of a fan of Mike McDaniel as I am, and after a poor start to the year, I am not calling for his job by any means, but I think the Dolphins are in a very complicated situation for a few reasons. If they fire general manager Chris Grier, which could very easily happen at season's end, then we are in a situation where the pending GM would have to both want to work with Mike McDaniel and presumably want Tua to be his quarterback for the next few years. I think it was wildly ignorant for Chris Grier to not bring in a viable backup quarterback prior to the 2024 season, knowing Tua's injury history and hoping that he would be able to play another full 17-game season. Football is an incredibly violent game, and Tua, or any quarterback season, is one offensive lineman falling down or maybe getting a quarter of a second late start on a play and having a pass rusher absolutely drill them from the blind side from the starting quarterback season being over. And this was already with a quarterback who had a lengthy concussion history. We saw teams prioritize the backup quarterback position this offseason, and for good reason, as playing 17 games in the NFL for anybody, let alone a player who takes hits from 300-pound linemen while standing in a stationary position, is a grueling task. And for Miami to not prioritize the backup quarterback position entering the year was always playing with fire. This roster is also very thin outside of a couple of positions, and it's also not good enough. And that point can't be driven home enough. Teams are built through the draft, and Miami's 2023 draft class was 4 total players, 2 of which aren't on the roster, and offensive lineman Ryan Hayes, and Cardinals backup tight end Elijah Higgins. Relying on Cam Smith and Devon Achane to be an entire 2-man draft class just 20 games into their careers, not surprisingly, didn't produce great draft results. Losing their 2023 first-round pick due to tampering obviously didn't help the situation, but I also think it's fair to say that even if they had that pick, that I don't think the Dolphins would all of a sudden be competing with the Bills and Chiefs to, really go after the AFC title one year. And I think there's a lot of problems moving forward with Miami. I also think there's a crowd that wants to make this a Tua Tagovailoa exclusive problem, and the reality is, it's not. They have a lot more problems than Tua. Whenever you average over 5 yards per carry one year and then average less than 3.8 yards per carry the following, there's going to be big problems. And that also factors in the fact that they lost 2 offensive linemen in free agency. So when your offensive line isn't as good the following year as it was in 2023, when the ground game was the bread and butter of the offense, and there was a reason that Raheem Mostert had 21 total touchdowns in 2023, and you can't really lean on the ground game at all the following year, and the fact that you have just 33 points through 3 games kind of speaks to how bad of a situation they're in. The roster all throughout is aging. Tyreek Hill's 30, Jalen Ramsey's going to be 30, Kendall Fuller's going to be 30 in February, and they're going to have so many positions to replace over the next few years, along with paying Tua Tagovailoa a $200 million contract that we didn't really even have to discuss Tua all that much in this video because of where the Dolphins roster is. And I know some people may say, well, they may have put up a better effort against the Seahawks and they may have even won that game. I personally don't think they would have, but guys, even with Tua in the last 3 games, this has nothing to do with his contract. In the last 3 games against Buffalo, they have been outscored 100-44. Whether Tua was on the rookie scale contract, whether he was getting paid $50 million a year, that doesn't change that the results stink. And the reality is this team is not going to win the division this year. And the reality is they're not going to win 3 straight playoff games to go to the Super Bowl. So when you think about the Miami Dolphins in the grand scheme of things, with an aging wide receiver that obviously isn't going to play forever, and with Teron Armstead, who has missed a lot of games throughout the past couple of years, what is their plan? What are they trying to do? Are we going to, bring Jordan Poyer in, bring Calais Campbell in, bring Odell Beckham in, who hasn't played a game for the Dolphins yet, and just say, all right, guys, let's put our best effort together and hopefully we win 9 games, hopefully get to the wild card round, and then lose? They're not even going to be able to do that this year. The Miami Dolphins have a lot of problems, and I don't know what the solution is. If this was Madden, which it's obviously not, and it's a lot more complicated than this, but the easy solution would be to trade everybody and effectively start over. And that's what I think they're eventually going to do. But for as many 30-plus-year-old players they have on their roster, or guys that are 29 about to turn 30, you want results now more than ever. You don't want to be on this wild card fringe spot, and the reality is they can't beat the Buffalo Bills when it matters. They are the little brother in the division, and obviously the Bills haven't had the success the Chiefs have had over the past few years, but forget Kansas City for Miami. If you can't get out of the division, it really doesn't matter, and I don't think Miami's going to get out of the division for at least 2024, at least 2025. I mean, guys, we're looking at minimum 2026 until this team can really start to compete, because they're going to have to rebuild, they're going to have to retool, and there's a very strong possibility that they have a new general manager for the 2025 draft, which creates a whole new set of problems, because now we have a GM that's not tied to the quarterback, a GM that's not tied to the head coach, who has not produced well so far through the 3 games in 2024, and I really don't know what the outcome for the Miami Dolphins is. All I know is it's going to be a very long process for this team to get back and to seriously try and compete, and this is already for a franchise that hasn't won a playoff game since the year 2000. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please like and subscribe, as only about 31% of people watching are subscribed, and helps the channel tremendously. Until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.